Welcome to another episode of Deep Think. I'm your host, Antoun Issa. Tareq Baconi is a renowned Palestinian-British author and scholar. Tareq grew up in Amman, Jordan, but his story begins in Palestine. His family were expelled in the 1948 Nakba and they fled to Lebanon, but they had to flee again in the 1970s when civil war broke out in Lebanon, this time relocating to Amman, Jordan, which is where Tareq's childhood begins. Tareq recently wrote a memoir about his family's journey and his own, and visited Melbourne, where I had the privilege to speak to him at the Melbourne Writers Festival in front of a packed crowd at the Wheeler Centre. It was a conversation that I had been looking forward to for months, because Tareq and I have certain parallels. Tareq is queer, as am I, and his story not only touched on the trauma inflicted upon his family as a result of the ethnic cleansing they experienced in Palestine, but also how identities compete within ourselves. His queer identity versus his cultural identity growing up in a hyper-patriarchal society in Jordan. Tareq ended up relocating again to London in his adult life to explore himself to his full extent. And his memoir captures all the nuances and complexities associated with that. It's a story that I, and I think many others, can relate to. I'd like to thank the Melbourne Writers Festival for giving me the chance to republish our talk, and I hope you find it as fascinating as I did. Here it is. Welcome, everyone. A full house, great to see. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge that we are on the lands of the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung peoples of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay my respect to their elders, past and present, and to all First Nations with us in this room. And I think it's also important that when we do these acknowledgements, it's not just a formality, but an occasion for all of us to reflect on our place on this land. Indigenous Australians make up 3% of the population, according to the census, which means 97% of us are not from here. And I think it's really important that when we do these acknowledgements, we acknowledge that First Nations have a very special connection to this land. And I'd also like to read out that this session is presented in partnership with PEN Melbourne. The PEN International Melbourne Centre advocates on behalf of writers who are silenced for peacefully practicing their profession. PEN International's 2026 case list documents a troubling global pattern. Space for expression, culture, and dissent is shrinking as governments intensify efforts to silence critical expression and target writers for their work. The PEN empty chair signifies the writer who cannot be here because they have been silenced. The empty chair today is for Amal Khalil. Lebanese journalist Amal Khalil and photographer Zainab Faraj were covering developments near the town of Al-Tayri when an Israeli strike hit the vehicle in front of them. They ran into a nearby house, which was then also targeted by an Israeli strike that killed Khalil and wounded Faraj. Israel's disregard for the lives of journalists and for international laws designed to protect them is unparalleled. The Committee to Protect Journalists documents that Israel has now killed more journalists than any other government since CPJ began collecting data in 1992, making this war the deadliest on record for journalists. PEN urges the swift, transparent, and independent investigations into the killing of all journalists by Israel, particularly since October 2023. PEN International strongly condemns the deliberate targeting of Amal Khalil and Zainab Faraj in southern Lebanon and calls on the International Criminal Court to investigate this attack as a potential war crime. I'll also add a note that Amal worked for the newspaper that I first worked for in Beirut, and I recall I was working on the English side, and and Amal was young, I was very young, and I recall her work from South Lebanon just being so thorough and so well reported. She really gave an insight into that area, and so her loss is deeply mourned. And now, to turn to our fabulous visitor from the UK or the US. Where are you living these days, Tareq? UK. Tareq Baconi is a Palestinian writer, scholar, and activist. He is the grandson of refugees from Jerusalem and Haifa and grew up between Amman and Beirut. His work has appeared in, among others, the New York Times and the BAFLA, and he contributes essays to the New York Review of Books and London Review of Books. His award-winning BFI short, One Like Him, a queer love story set in Jordan, screened in over 30 festivals. He's the author of Hamas Contained, A History of Palestinian Resistance, which was shortlisted for the Palestine Book Award, and his family memoir and brilliant memoir, which I just finished reading for this session, Fire in Every Direction, which you all need to buy at the end of this, if you haven't already. And we're going to start our conversation. Tareq, it's so great to have you in Melbourne with us.
It's so good to be here. Thanks for having me.
So I emailed you last week, and I said, your memoir, I think, reads like a memoir for a lot of Arab queers who have gone through the same process. It could have been mine. I was like, oh my God, is Tareq me? So it was deeply moving. My book is covered in yellow highlights, just amazing lines. I want to start off, and it had me thinking about so many threads, and I'm going to struggle to pack this conversation into 45 minutes. And just a heads up, we are going to do Q&A at the end, so get your thoughts ruminating. I feel for queers there's a constant tension between our identities, the various parts of ourselves, whether it's a competition between our queer selves and our cultural identities, and they're always kind of at odds. Sometimes there's harmony, but often they're at odds. I found with your book, it was these various parts of you, your queer identity, your cultural identity, battling for, I don't know, the domain, where do they fit within Tareq Baconi? Can you speak to us about your upbringing in Amman as a queer boy with the expectations of, you know, hypermasculinity and how that sat with yourself?
Well, it's so good to be in conversation with you, and I just want to start by noting that his book has also just been released. So if you want another queer memoir from the region, then I'm also looking forward to reading it. So congratulations. Thank you for starting with that question. I think that the notion of compartmentalization, queer people, regardless of where they are familiar with this sense of, in a way, covering. You're sort of sometimes wearing a mask in order to exist in heteronormative society. And so there's division within the self. We're sort of broken up into parts. And a lot of my thinking and a lot of my work is about reintegration. How do we take all of these different parts that we're told can't coexist and can't fit together? How can we take all of these parts and weave them back together? It's an act of becoming whole. And I really think of my creative process and my writing as doing that, as trying to overcome this notion that that we exist in silos and trying to bring the whole of who I am into all of these different encounters. And I think specifically in the context of queer Palestinians, this kind of division, and this is not only for Palestine, it's for the region, but specifically for Palestinians, how colonial machinery exacerbates these divisions. So it sort of tells you that you can be one thing and not another. You can't coexist in all of these complex identities as a queer person, as a Palestinian person, and so on and so forth. And so this book in some ways is a way for me to do an act of integration. Now, growing up in Amman, and I don't think it's specific to Amman. I think queer folks would see that everywhere. But growing up in Amman, the notion of hypermasculinity really defines everything. I mean, I think it's a patriarchal society. It's a homophobic society in many ways. And growing up as a queer child who, growing up in the 80s and early 90s, not really understanding what queerness was, not really having the language to explain it to myself, to understand myself, let alone explain it to others. The language that was available in the world around me was of masculinity. It's what it means to be a man in that space is very clear. And so that's the model then of manness. That's the model of masculinity. And it was a model that I tried to achieve and consistently failed.
Right.
And it was in that failure that I was then able to find or to try to find or articulate different ways of being. But it was against that model of hypermasculinity that was made so all-encompassing.
And was that encompassed in your love for your best friend Ramzi? Because I I loved your love for Ramzi. But you seem to be quite aware. I felt you were critiquing your own love for Ramzi throughout the book as, was it a genuine love for someone else? Or was it an aspiration to emulate this model of masculinity that you couldn't attain because you were on the inside queer?
I think honestly it was both. I mean, just to give some context for if people haven't read the book, I mean, the book is described as a memoir, and it is a memoir, or it has become a memoir. But really the book started as a way for me to try to make sense of a childhood love or of a teenage love. So my neighbor, who was also a very close friend, became almost a member of my family. Very close to me and my brothers. Was someone I developed feelings for and ultimately fell in love with. And that relationship was not a relationship that was going anywhere. And you'll have to read the book to see what happens. But so I always knew that this was a relationship that once I had the language to understand, that I would come back to. And that was the impetus for the book. I wanted to try to explain to myself, maybe even to Ramzi, what I couldn't, 25 years ago. And in that process of revisiting our relationship, I realized that, yes, I wasn't sure whether I was in love with him or I was infatuated with the idea of him. He embodied this masculinity that I knew that if I wanted to belong in Amman, if I wanted to be loved, if I wanted to not be ostracized, I also needed to embody. And so he became this vision of perfect masculinity. He became this person that I was desperate to become, and also this person I was desperate to be with. And so I don't know if that was infatuation or if it was love. It's young love, it's teenage love. One doesn't know where they begin and where the other begins.
Right.
So it was that. It was a lot of that.
Do you think that's, and I think this is probably a common question for a lot of, how's mine? Is mine good? Can everyone hear me? Great. I think this is something I think a lot of queers think about, which is what is at the root of this? Is it, which is how I think a lot of our stories begin, especially those of us who come in patriarchal societies, which is this self-loathing of, damn, why am I like this? Is that at the root of this?
I mean, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think there's self-loathing. I think there's shame. I think there's a lot of shame. It's, I think it manifests for different people differently, but it is that. It is the encounter with the heteronormative society and an inability to be oneself without hedging, this sense of going back to the point about holding oneself whole. You're always hiding a part of yourself because you want to pass. And I think in the book, one of the pieces of writing that were an inspiration for me was a book called Covering by Kenji Yoshino, who is a scholar in the US who talks about civil liberties, but he coins the term covering. And that really resonated with me. The sense that depending on who you're talking to, depending on what context you're in, you're always covering a part of yourself. And you must feel this when you go back to the region. There's, even as someone who's, for me, as comfortably queer, as public as, I just published a memoir about queerness. So it's not like I can hide, but still in conversations with various people, I would hide. I would not talk about this, or I would change my tone here. It's a form of passing.
Yeah.
And I think that is grounded in shame. I think that's grounded in the sense of also not just shame, also hypervigilance. You're worried that you're going to be judged. You're worried that you're going to be attacked. And so, I think this coming to the self with love is, or this work of integration that I'm talking about, is holding that intention of not covering, of always trying to hold yourself whole with dignity, bringing all of your parts to the table. And I think that's really, for queer folk, I think, a constant process of sort of undoing that self-loathing and coming to a place of acceptance.
Did you find, I'm asking, this is like, I'm kind of like self-reflecting here as I'm asking you these questions, because I ask myself these questions all the time, which is, has queerness served as a constraint on what we could have been if we did if we were like a Ramzi? Or has it worked as a liberator because it's made us escape the shackles of this heteronormative, patriarchal, rigid pathway that's set up for the majority of people, but we get to escape and live freely? Is it a bit of both?
Yeah, I mean, listen, for me, queerness is the best thing that could have ever happened to me. I think it completely, like you say, it completely liberated me. It's almost like as a queer person, I'm able to walk around the world and see these systems of control, these systems of oppression, how they work. And that's not to say that non-queer people can't do that. I'm sure that, there are many people who aren't queer who can see, how the patriarchy works, how colonialism works, how these systems function. But as a queer person, I think that allowed me to transcend the limitations that are imposed on people. If you want to talk specifically about Ramzi, I don't know who Ramzi is today. We haven't spoken in 25 years, but in my head, Ramzi is a typical straight Arab man, and in many ways, for me, that's a restricted state of being. That's a way of being that conforms and that has everything given to them. I mean, obviously, this is hugely reductionist, but this sense of you're not existing against the grain. You're existing in a way. Your very existence is not tolerated but celebrated by sort of society and this world around you. And so, in many ways, I think that is a state of relaxing into oneself. Whereas for me, I think queerness is really a work of constant working on the self, on these systems, trying to sort of pursue liberation, equality, justice, sort of thinking about what that means. And I've said this before, for me, queerness is a political identity as much as it's a sort of a sexual orientation. It's a way of being in the world, in the margins, that's sort of resisting these silences, resisting these sites of oppression.
Right. I'm interested in your process at how you got to that, because obviously when you started in the first part of your book, you're not there, right? No. And you had to move to London and to kind of get to that point. I want you to speak about that process, but I also want to share my process in coming to that realization. What you described about queerness allowing us, when we think about ourselves as a society, where do people who are like us fit in society? We're programmed this way. It's not by make-believe. We've always existed. But where do we sit in the realm of society? And when I was in Beirut during the Arab Spring, I just got to know and understand that at the forefront of a lot of these Arab Spring protests and pushes and drives for democracy and better governance and social justice issues across the Arab world, Egypt, Tunisia, Jordan, Lebanon, and so forth, there were queers, not out. A lot of them weren't out. I knew they were, but they weren't out. But they were at the forefront, not wearing the badge, not wearing a rainbow flag, not flying the queer flag, but flying the flag for, I guess, a better society for all of us. And so I think if you look through history, and even today in Australia, wherever you go, queers are always at the front line, I feel like, carrying the rest of society. Why is that? Why are we like that?
But listen, I mean, today I just came from New York. I spent a lot of time in New York. If you look at the Palestine movement today, in New York specifically, but across the US, it's queer folk and women leading the fight against genocide. But that's not surprising to me. I think that, when if you want to talk about the region or specifically about Palestine, queer folks are coming out and saying, Palestinian liberation, first and foremost, for a queer individual, is dismantling Israeli apartheid. First and foremost, liberation for queer Palestinians is ending Israel's apartheid, is decolonization and freeing Palestine. It's not same-sex marriage. It's ending colonialism.
Right.
And it's because I think queer folk understand how these systems of oppression are interlinked and how they work together. Now, there's a lot of discourse that's coming in specifically from the West saying, LGBTQ plus rights, and you see that taken to a sadistic extreme in the sort of the Zionist machinery that says, if you go to Gaza, you're going to be thrown off a building, or, we're doing this genocide in Gaza to liberate queer folk. I mean, this language of the LGBT plus that limits queerness to same-sex relations or gender fluid, whatever it is, and removes this sort of imperial system. It removes the violence that's enacting itself on queer Black and brown bodies. And I think queer folks are able to understand that. They're able to understand, or, I'm able to understand, certainly the people who are marching on the streets in the Arab revolutions were marching for democracy, because first and foremost, that's what's needed, dismantling authoritarianism for queer life to flourish.
But I also wonder, about this constant natural alliance, I think, between, queers and women, particularly in hyper-patriarchal societies. Yeah. And when you look at what they're up against, and I think this is why it's important, with media and news and the way we describe conflicts and issues around the world, it's very surface level. Yeah. It doesn't go to the core. And I feel, when we look at it through a lens of why, and ask the question, why are queers and women often at the forefront of these revolutionary movements and pushing for change in their societies? It's what are they up against? And so when you look at the Arab world and the Arab regimes, actually all, wherever you look, it's hyper masculinity, it's hyper patriarchy. You've got these men who are sitting on top of these states, these powerful states that are, enacting violence, enacting repression. And we don't talk enough about the hyper-masculine, toxic masculine element and the toxic patriarchal elements to a lot of the conflicts that are taking place. But when we look at it, what have we got? We've got Donald Trump, we've got Netanyahu, we've got Putin, we had Bashar al-Assad, we had, we've got Sisi, we've got the Gulf dictators. What do they all have in common? Mm-hmm. They are hyper-patriarchal, super-masculine, fragile men with a lot of money and a lot of weapons. And so there is a gender dimension to this. And you said yesterday in Queer Stories that the Palestinian struggle is feminist. So can you unpack what you meant by that?
Yeah, I also want to say, just a footnote on that, is you also get very powerful women at the top of these. It's not just a story of men, but I think it's the system that's hypermasculine. It's the system that's patriarchal. But you get women. I think about women who are celebrated leaders in the Israeli the so-called IDF, the Israeli occupation forces, the colonial force. It's not just men who are colonialists, women are too, but the systems are hyper-masculine, the systems are patriarchal. And I think that the struggle for a free Palestine is a feminist struggle and a queer struggle. And what I mean by that is it is a struggle to dismantle those systems. And I think feminism allows us, it's sort of the tip of the spear, it allows us to come into these systems and break them up from within. And I'll talk about it in the context of my book. As I said, I didn't start thinking about this book with the intention of writing a memoir. I was writing a story about these two boys in Amman, and I was sort of putting myself in their world again, and very quickly their world became their homes, and their homes became the histories of their homes, and their homes are Palestinian. Both of these boys are Palestinian in Amman. Why are they in Amman? Why are they not in Palestine? And so very quickly it becomes a history of that. And as I'm writing that history, it's difficult to, people would think that I'm lying when I say this, but actually the act of writing is really, for me at least, is really one where the text is leading the way. I'm not coming in with the intention. The text is telling me where it wants to go. And when I finished the book, I realized that I had written a maternal history, sort of the way that Palestine was given to me from my mother and from her mother, and how I was struck by this when it was done, that I had written this book where it was so clear to me that my dad, my grandfathers, my brothers were marginal to the story. The story was really my maternal grandmothers, my mother, and myself. And I reflected a lot on why that was. It's not like my dad wasn't political. He was. My brothers are not political. I mean, they want to pretend they are. They're really not. But it's this. I do think it's this sense of, I don't know. I started thinking about my maternal grandmother as someone who fled Haifa in 1948 when she was in her late teens, early 20s, and of living with that dispossession, but somehow and and rarely talking about it. She rarely talked about Haifa or the Nakba unless asked, but somehow managed to pass that on to me in her cooking, in the way that she talks about her friends, in the way that our home was. I was raised mostly by my maternal grandmother. I mean, my parents were struggling for work and so busy, so I was left in her care, and I inherited Palestine from her unknowingly, organically. And I think that for me is very much sort of how this maternal line passes revolutionary spirits in intimate spaces, not necessarily in sort of this loud, so I've reflected a lot on what feminism, how my history and how coming to Palestine for me was a feminist and a queer entry.
I'm interested you said that this came out through the writing process, because this came out through my writing process about my family memoir. Like the matriarchs of our cultures are the quiet ones.
Yes.
They're not the ones that are loud in the living rooms, in the family home, but they're the ones that kind of carry everything quietly and silently, and then have the most powerful silent roles.
Yes.
And so I share that with you. But, you're a family that experienced ethnic cleansing, and you're a family that's experienced and still experiencing trauma from that ethnic cleansing. But people react to trauma differently. And I was very interested in reading the differences between your parents, your mother and your father, and how they responded to their own ethnic cleansing stories. Can you elaborate a bit more for that?
Yeah, I mean, that, and also for me, the difference between my grandmother and my mother. So as I said, my grandmother was talked about her dispossession, rarely talked about her dispossession. There was a lot of silence, and there was a lot of faith. So she was a devout Christian woman, and she turned to the divine in everything. Everything happened because there's a grand plan. We might not understand. She kept saying God works in mysterious ways. You don't understand what's happening, but it's happening for a reason. And the way we must come to this is through forgiveness. They hate and they kill. They don't know why they do this, and we forgive, which, is whatever was the language that allowed her to sort of get through her days. My mother, on the other hand, was almost the complete opposite. She didn't herself experience ethnic cleansing in Palestine, but she grew up as a revolutionary spirit in Lebanon, was very active, was working for Palestine, organizing in university, and because I had her comrades killed, and because of that, she had to flee Beirut. And her politics were angry and loud and active, and so I and the title of my book, Fire in Every Direction, is in reference to her anger for me felt like a fire, and it was burning everywhere, and that rage, which was very confusing to me as a child, today I understand and respect and value. I'm very grateful to it, because she showed me how one must exist against injustice. My father, on the other hand, even though he shared her political views in many ways, was a pragmatist. She wanted to burn everything down, and he wanted to work within the institutions to try to push for our rights and as best as one can. And I think that's where the patriarchy works in many ways as well. The institutions accommodate him and hear him, and they don't hear her, and they silence her. And so there's all these injustices in micro and macro that are shaping the way that she exists in the world, as versus how he exists in the world. And I think I think that's at the core of the difference between them.
In a way, I feel like the dichotomy between your parents kind of represents how the Palestinians on a more broader political level have responded to the calamities of the last 80 years, where you've got, a cohort of the Palestinians that are like, resist, and you've got a cohort of the Palestinians who are like, let's find a way to accommodate and move on. Do you think your father found the personal peace he was looking for by taking that pragmatic approach?
No, because I think, I think that he realized at some point, even though I think he wouldn't necessarily articulate it the way that I'm going to articulate it, but I think he realized at some point what most Indigenous people do, which is that these institutions are never going to reform themselves, and that those institutions are premised on your death, actually, and on extermination. And I think for him, the facade started breaking around 2003, which is also my moment of coming to political consciousness, which is the US invasion of Iraq. And the discourse around it, and the way that all of these sort of systems of international law that are sort of meant to have, global governance and global rights were a facade for imperialism. And so the whole, and even then, I remember sitting in front of the TV watching the invasion with him, and him saying, the Americans must have a plan. There has to be a reason that we don't understand. And even when I'm 17 turning 18, and at that point, and looking at him and thinking, really? I mean, it's pretty clear what's happening here. Right. And so I don't think he ever found peace. I think that he just couldn't acknowledge that our lives were expendable.
Right.
I mean, that's where you get to with that logic, that for these systems of power, you're collateral damage. And I think to get to that recognition is a very cynical and very painful place to get to.
A deeper question on this same theme, because over the last few years of the genocide, throughout my own process of writing my own family memoir, I got to thinking a lot about erasure and about connection to land, what it means to be native, and why that's so essential to feel grounded in your own personal life. And then when you look at, and I was reading your memoir and I was thinking, God, it's so similar, and I was talking to another friend who's gay from Beirut, actually from Tripoli, and we were just also talking about genocide and everything related in the last war. And it's just like, look at our lives. We've just been bouncing around. He's in Saudi now. He was in London before. He was in New York before that. He tried Beirut. Your life is very similar. My life is very similar. We've been bouncing around the world. Is losing our Indigenous connection to our land in our lives, is this the source of our constant unsettling and unease that makes us constantly wandering and bouncing and trying to figure out where we are?
I mean, that's a beautiful, I think that's a part of it, yes. I do think that not being able to be grounded and having that violent discontinuity imposed on us, this sort of removal from the land, and not only removal from that land, the constant ongoing imperial wars and colonization. It's not like we were removed and then that's it. This the genocide is ongoing. Israeli war machines are attacking Lebanon as we speak. This constant uprooting, this constant violence that's ongoing, that's relentless, is a way of, I think, discontinuing our connection to land, but also to our bodies, to our histories, to our families, and maybe most relevant to this panel, to our narratives and our stories. Right. A Palestinian narrative, just like a Lebanese, is heavily contested. I mean, just to be able to say the basics, that there's a genocide that's ongoing against the Palestinian people by an apartheid regime, is almost unutterable in most places in the West, unless there's a concerted effort to make that space. Right. And so I think we're constantly facing that erasure, which leaves us unsettled in our communities and in our skin, but also I think becomes a site of creativity and a site of resistance and a site of insisting, as the colonialism is ongoing, our resistance is ongoing. Right. And so it's a constant way of living and of being. And I don't know, I've reflected a lot on this notion of land and belonging, because obviously, in our quest as an anti-colonial movement for Palestinians specifically, the quest is obviously to get our land back, to get our homeland back. But it's not only that. Our homeland is not only the land, it's also our ways of being, our narratives, our histories. And so that we can already access today. I'm already enacting return here today, talking to you about Palestine, keeping Palestine alive in our hearts and in our minds. That's my way of return until I can go back. Right? And so this is, the land, of course, is important, but I'm seeking belonging also outside of the land until I can undo this exile.
You went back to Palestine.
Yes.
What did you experience? What did you feel when you got there? Did you feel, this is my home, this is my land? Or did you feel a sense of anger?
I felt both. I mean, it was incredible. So growing up, I had a Jordanian passport, and Jordanian men between the ages of 18 and 45 are not allowed into. It's very difficult to get a visa to get into through the Israeli authorities to get to Palestine. And so I wasn't able to go to Palestine until I naturalized as a British citizen, and the irony was not lost on me. So my first trip as a British citizen to Palestine was to Palestine, and I didn't know what to expect. There were many things that were happening. One was this sense of deep familiarity, even though I had never been, but it felt legible to me. I could understand the place. I could sort of see myself there. And it was this incredible draw. I mean, I moved there shortly after my first visit. And it was, and I write about this in the book as this sense of having grown up there, even though I had never been. And I think that's my grandmother. I think that's me sort of growing up under her sort of spirit and the world that she built for us. I think it was a Palestinian world. And so all the people I met, the communities, the accents, the food, all of that was deeply familiar. But there was blinding rage. I mean, I couldn't, I think what I couldn't do, it's funny because for the Palestinians who remained and who have interacted with the Israeli colonial forces, I think they, by necessity, have had to normalize a certain existence. Even if they resist, they're still seeing Israeli soldiers everywhere. They're interacting with their colonialists daily.
Right.
That was new I had never seen an Israeli soldier up close before, growing up in the Shatat and the diaspora. And I just didn't, the sense of outrage that, you're a 17-year-old soldier with a machine gun telling me I can go here, or who gives you, this is my home. I'm looking for my grandparents' home. And so this rage was blind. I mean, and it was exacerbated. So on that trip, I went to Gaza, and it was exacerbated there because Gaza is an extreme of Israeli colonialism. This imprisonment and this sort of ghettoization of Palestinians in Gaza. If you are not from Gaza and you're not raised in that environment, but you're coming from the outside, you see it in a way that I think, having lived it, you're forced to be blind to, or you're forced to unsee it because you have to exist, right? And it was so extreme that I think it was one of the most beautiful, but also one of the most difficult experiences of my life, sort of going into Gaza, knowing that I can also leave. Why? Because I have a British passport, and under what authority? So it was a very complicated, very messy return.
Right. And I think just to extrapolate that and put it in our own context in Australia, I think that's something that First Nations often feel in this land, being told where to go, what to do in their own country that they've had for 60,000 years by a system that just popped up out of nowhere. You went to Gaza, though, and I got a sense from your book that Gaza was very special to you.
Yes.
Explain that. Why was it special?
I fell in love with Gaza for many reasons. I mean, I think it's a beautiful place. I think the people there are beautiful in their insistence on life and survival on their own terms against all odds. They're facing the machinery of extermination, as we now see and understand, and they continue to lead. It's not about glorifying it. They're actually continuing to lead very normal lives, which is what makes it incredible, because their insistence on normalcy and on living day-to-day life, and this is what Palestinian sumud is, the sort of the determination to remain steadfast in everyday mundane life despite these systems of erasure. And so I think on the baseline it was that. But it was also, this incredible humor, which people who live in extremely violent and unjust situations understand this turn to Black humor. It's the humor, the food, the hospitality. It was just the most welcoming environment. And I had gone there as a writer and as a scholar, and I had, studied the history of the place for a long time before I was finally able to go there. And to be able to access that life while knowing the history of colonialism, how it was continuing to enact itself, and understanding that actually Zionist colonization was most acute and most present in Gaza. I mean, if you go to Haifa, or if you go to the Galilee, in northern Palestine, colonization there looks different than colonization, let's say, in Ramallah, in the West Bank. They're different. On the spectrum of colonization, in 48, in the state that calls itself Israel, that colonization, the settler tells you it's done, and so you call it an Israeli state. In the West Bank, it's occupied and the colonization is ongoing. In Gaza is the most extreme form of Zionism. You see the ghettoization, you see the constant bombardment, you see the constant death. And so it's the flip side of that. It's the side of the most ingenious Palestinian resistance, because you're facing Zionism in its most undiluted form. And so Palestinian resistance there is at its most alive.
Right.
And obviously the genocide has shown that to full effect. But so I think I was grappling with all of those feelings and sort of understandings of the place. And I think even then, so this was in 2014, I went after that Israeli attack on Gaza, which at the time was unimaginable in its violence. I mean, now it looks like child's play. But so I went in the aftermath of that, and even then, in all of my writing since and a bit before, I said, and I constantly wrote that this is a stopgap, that extermination is going to happen here.
Right.
Because I understood that this was a site of resistance that was intolerable to the Israelis.
Because even the demonstration of happiness and life continuing is an act of resistance.
Right.
They want to crush your will and your spirit.
Right.
And I want to ask you about this, because I feel like last night you said words, Palestine will be free, and that's something that you think it's a fait accompli that eventually will happen. But could it be also that Israel is succeeding in its colonization? Because as we know from Australian history, colonization isn't, we're here today and tomorrow there's a country. It's a gradual process. It takes a century, even longer, for it to occur, happen in the Americas as well. And when we look at the wars today in South Lebanon, what's happened in Palestine and Gaza, and you put that in the timeline of the last 80 or so years, we have had constant wars visited upon us. And with those constant wars, there's been attempts to rebuild, like in Gaza and in South Lebanon. And the Israelis 10 or 20 years later will come and just mow it all down again. And part of that is their attempt to drive us off our lands, make our lands uninhabitable, crush our spirits so we don't rise up being happy again, and just force us to leave and wipe out our civilization. And to agree, it's kind of worked. I'm living here because my country is uninhabitable. You're here because your country is erased. So they might not achieve their current objectives in terms of, they might not conquer Gaza tomorrow, they might not conquer South Lebanon tomorrow, but they are degrading our societies. Is that not a successful process in itself with regards to colonization?
Listen, that's a very difficult question. I mean, every settler colony and every settler will want you to think that the act of extermination and colonization is done and dusted, and that's a part of the past. That's think about this country. That's extermination and colonization happened. Now we're a democratic state, and we're talking about the right of indigenous people. Think about the U.S. They want to pretend that their history was built as a sort of maybe there was extermination and genocide, but today they're a land of immigrants and democracy. So the settler always wants to present this as a history. It's a fait accompli. It was done. Now we can move into democracy. And I think that's that's Israel is a settler colony that's aspiring to be what Australia and the US are, But the reality is that here colonization is ongoing. In the US, colonization is ongoing. And in Palestine, certainly colonization is ongoing. So it's never a story of getting to an end point. I think there's this constant effort to try to exterminate the indigenous community, and the indigenous community is constantly resisting. So you're right, I'm here, but I'm here talking about return. So I'm here on my own terms, and I'm here resisting. I'm not ceding sovereignty over anywhere, over Palestine from the river to the sea. I don't recognize the state of Israel. So for me, that is their failure. They can claim that they succeeded, but they haven't, because our history is still alive, right? But having said that, it is a paradox in the sense that I think militarily, Israel has never been stronger. They have there's an ongoing act of genocide and ethnic cleansing. I don't think it's unimaginable to think of the West Bank being next. I think they've dominated the region. They've destroyed South Lebanon. They've tried to, the Trump tweets about destroying the civilization in Iran. They're exporting genocide into the region. But at the same time, Zionism has never been weaker. I mean, people now understand what Zionism is. We're no longer talking about, a two-state solution and peace process and Israel as a democracy. We're talking about the Nakba and colonization and genocide. Zionism now is, as for me, as it should be, seen as a racist ideology and as a racist identity. That before the genocide would have been much hard. It would have been much harder for me to say the things that I say and do and write in the places that I do before the cost has been staggering and inhuman. But there has been an ideological blow to Zionism. And so I think it's that, there's this question of success and failure is very much on the settler terms. As far as the indigenous community, for the indigenous community, we'll always resist. As long as one of us exists, we'll be resisting. And that resistance is going to make their claim to victory untenable.
I'm going to open to questions in just a moment, so if the volunteers with the microphones can get ready. But I'm going to ask one more question before we get there, because I want to turn to faith. You grew up in a Christian household. You grew up praying every night. Your grandmother was very religious, but then you turned away from faith. I think a lot of us queers who grew up in those settings have a similar kind of path, where we grew up in those environments. God is ever present in our lives, and then we get into adulthood and we kind of let it go. The genocide in Gaza, though, and also in South Lebanon, has made me revisit my approach to faith. And I wonder if it's had the same for you. And the question I want to ask is, without the faith that is so grounded in the people of Gaza and in South Lebanon and in your grandmother, could they have survived? Could they have resisted as long? And has that made you rethink your approach to faith?
Yes, absolutely. And even before the genocide, I have to say that I walked away from Christianity in my late teens, but I don't think I walked away from faith. I believed in something I couldn't articulate, this sort of sense of sort of a divinity that was beyond our human capacity for understanding. I feel like that was embedded in me through Christianity, and when I came out of Christianity, I think it left its mark. And I'm thinking of this question also in light of the question we just asked about defeat. The genocide in Gaza was probably one of the hardest periods of my life, and I feel like such an asshole saying that with the privilege that I have living in a place like London. But it was devastating, seeing what was happening, witnessing it, but more than witnessing it, feeling so powerless to end it, and feeling so hurt in a way that I still don't think I fully understood about how in the world around me life was ongoing. You could go to a cafe and order coffee and then go and have a book launch, and then while there was mass extermination on all of our phones. That was devastating. And it created, I think it's changed me as a person. I think it's changed all of us as humans, even if we don't understand it, witnessing this genocide. And I think I turned to faith to survive, to just continue to sort of live on a day to day. And so I think that spirituality that I had always had within me sort of morphed into something a lot more present and tangible in my life. And it's the only way that I can look at what's happening and say, no, we haven't been defeated, because everything around me is saying, hundreds of thousands of people are getting killed still, and nothing is changing. So it's very easy to come out and say, yeah, I mean, and you know what? One of the most painful instances was when a Palestinian friend turned to me and said, wouldn't we save more lives if we just conceded defeat? And but obviously we wouldn't, because if you concede defeat, they're still wanting to exterminate you. The point is you shouldn't exist. But to against those odds, to come out and say we're still fighting for liberation and we're not going anywhere, is an act of faith. I mean, that's what revolution is. It's an act of faith.
Wonderful. Before I get to questions, one more thing. Both Tareq and myself will be selling our books and signing at the Readings bookstore in the State Library, I believe, and the volunteers will help usher you and us how to get there. Do we have any questions for Tareq? Man in the middle.
Thank you for a fantastically heartfelt and brave discussion. I was curious, Tareq, what you might most wish that the Western queer bourgeois community understood. I know you've touched on that a bit, but are there a few things that you would really like to say and have us take on?
Should we do one by one?
I mean, they're all for you, حبيبي. مش ليه. أنت هون مش أنا.
Listen, I answer when I'm asked this often about what people, in these various spaces that I talk at could do. And my answer is always the same, which is that Palestine isn't a struggle that's only over there. Palestine is also a struggle that's here. So if we're thinking, if anything is sort of pushing you to think about what you can do to be in solidarity with Palestine, first and foremost is to be in solidarity with people here who are fighting for a more just system here, primarily, obviously, the indigenous peoples of these lands. What that means in terms of making sure that these governments are no longer committed to their acts of colonialism and violence and extermination. I think liberating Palestine, for me, is a thing that is an outcome that will usher us to a more just future for the world and the planet, for humans and non-humans alike, and I think that's something that is a struggle here as much as it is one there.
And I'll just add to that, I think the last few years have made it apparent and obvious that the webs that keep the systems of apartheid and genocide and colonialism, imperialism and inequality alive in all of our lives are all connected, which means our solidarity has to be connected if we're going to repel that. And so striving for a better Australia is also striving for a better Palestine, because what's driving the inequality that we're seeing in Australia are the same systems that's driving the colonialism in Palestine. Yes, to someone who just put their hand up. Someone at the back too? Yeah.
Hi, Tareq. It was such a lovely talk. Like you, I am Palestinian, Jordanian, grew up in Amman. And
I'm sorry.
I could very much relate to all the little things you mentioned about Amman. I moved here when I was 18, and the question I have for you is, obviously some countries and cultures are more hostile to queerness than others. Did you ever go through a phase where you felt rage towards your own culture and identity and country? And how did you reconcile with knowing that your country and culture sometimes probably didn't like you as much as you liked it?
Thank you for that. I did. Antoun alluded to this. I write about this in the book. My experience of Amman was a very dark one, growing up there, and my act of survival, I guess, was to leave Amman and move to London and to move to the UK. And I reflect on this in the book because I actually think it's something that wasn't only specific to me, but for me it was a formative moment of sort of landing in London and thinking, oh my God, I'm finally in the civilized world. Now I can be gay and people will accept me, and this is what civilization looks like, and this thing called liberalism is amazing, and I can be, I can be an atheist and no one will judge me. And it took a hot second for me to realize what liberalism is and actually how conditional it is for people like me, and how it's built on the backs of colonial subjects. And so, yes, I really grappled with this idea of understanding that the homophobia that I grew up in, that yes, other spaces might not have that homophobia, but that doesn't mean that they are tolerant or accepting of me, and really then being forced to acknowledge, as Antoun said, how these systems are interconnected, and coming back to Amman thinking, yeah, I understand that homophobia in Amman is a part of my struggle, while I'm also Palestinian in Amman, and understanding my Palestinian struggle in Amman, what that means, but also loving my people and loving my community. And going to Palestine, there's homophobia in Palestine, and I understand that my struggle for a free Palestine is also a struggle against homophobia in Palestine. So I think it's just a more nuanced way of dealing with some of these questions.
Can I add a part B? Sorry, just to interject. I'm going to insert another question here because you got me thinking. Thank you for that question. As queers from non-Western backgrounds, do we have no choice but to access our queerness through the West?
Yeah, I think, no, I don't think that's the only choice. I think that I thought that was the only choice. So my going to London was for me this sense of, Amman will never accept me. I don't even know how to find myself in Amman. I need to go and find myself elsewhere, which I did. And by the way, not only in London, in Sydney as well. I moved to Sydney for a year to sort of try to find what being queer means. But now I have great friends who are queer in the region who never left. And I look at them in awe because I sort of think you were able to access your queerness and build your communities and have love and sex and celebration and joy in ways that I thought were completely unattainable for me. I had to leave to come back, and you stayed and flourished. And so I don't think it's a prerequisite, but I think each their own in terms of the path. But I think it's incredible to be able to sort of see the flourishing of that life in the region.
Maybe it was just Amman then. Yeah. Any other questions?
Yes, another Amman-born Palestinian queer. Sorry.
Oh, wow.
You're doing a little bit of a cliche today.
Yeah.
I actually wanted to ask you about the queer histories of the region and how you might compare them to the current day. I think a lot of people in this room might not know that sodomy was decriminalised by the Ottomans in 1858. It was recriminalised by the British in 1936. It was decriminalised by the Jordanians in the West Bank in 1951, and only in 1988 in Israel. And that law that is often kind of cited by Israelis in terms of pinkwashing is still in place in Gaza today. So I kind of wanted to think about, like, if we're sort of thinking about our histories and colonialism and queerness, if you could kind of comment on some of the shifts that might have happened over the last century and a half.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. And I think that that's one of the things that, thinking about homophobia in the region and placing it within its proper historical context, it's a colonial import, and which is incredible to reflect on, because one of the ways that homophobia manifests, at least from people in the region, is to say, oh, you don't belong here, you're a foreign agent. And the Zionists use that to extreme effect. So Palestinians think of other queer Palestinians as Zionist implants, and the Zionist regime manipulates that. So if there's a queer individual in Palestine, they basically entrap them into acting as collaborators, and so there's a system of the sort of the colonial infringement into the region that exacerbates homophobia. and that creates this reality against queer people, when actually what is Indigenous, what's truth, is what you just articulated, which is a way of being that transcends some of these colonial imports, and that allows for not just a greater diversity in sexual orientation, but greater gender fluidity. And that's a reality not only in the Middle East, by the way, also across African countries and in Asian countries, where certainly in India, where sort of the British imported their homophobia and then created a train wreck in terms of rights for the LGBT plus community. But I think being aware of that history, I think this is why it's so important to look at the discourse coming out of the West today in terms of the LGBTQ plus rights, that divorces that discourse from the West's colonial and imperial history in the region. This sort of idea that, we just want safety for gays in the region, not only ends up obfuscating that history, but it creates contemporary excuses for imperial violence on the backs of these queer individuals.
I'll also just add that Rumi, the famous Persian poet who lived in Anatolia and was a Muslim mystic, devoted an entire big red book to his male lover. This was in the 14th century. And I'd also add that our very rich hammam culture in the Arab world is also an example of how Islamic society had a space that was, not outspoken, but was tolerated for same-sex, interactions throughout the centuries. So it wasn't that, queerness also didn't just pop up out of nowhere. Mm-hmm. It was always there. We have time for one more question. Or we can just have a party and just leave. Are we done? Okay, one more at the front.
I have a question. First of all, thank you very much. It was amazing listening to you both. I guess my question is perhaps a little bit more about the personal than the political, obviously, though you can't disentangle them. I guess I found it really interesting that you went from talking about your teenage years and then moving forward pretty quickly to the returning to Palestine part. And I guess there's a lot of period of time there that I'm really interested in hearing about. I just wondered whether you had any interest in doing a second memoir about that period of time.
God, no. But I mean, in the book, it's obviously there's more of a muddle through in that middle bit. But as I said, I really don't know how I ended up writing a memoir. I was opposed to the idea of writing a memoir, so the idea of writing another one is excruciating. But you will get your fix from that middle period in the book already.
Okay, well, in saying that, so both Tareq and I will be going to readings at the State Library. We're going signings,
not readings.
What? No, the readings is the bookstore.
Oh, I see. I see. Okay,
so we're both definitely going to be led by the volunteers to get there. So follow us if you want to get our books and sign and chat. We'll be there for a bit. And thank you all for coming. Round of applause for Tareq.